You are watching Space, the final frontier above and beyond, an open-minded channel. Today, we're going to explore two extraordinary stories separated by time, yet connected by a remarkable idea. One story comes from a man who claimed to have traveled here from the future. The other comes from a young man who proposed that something may have happened to our reality itself. Two different people. Two different moments in time. Two very different perspectives. And yet, when we place their statements side by side, an intriguing question emerges. What if they're both pointing toward the same phenomenon, but seeing it from different sides of the timeline? We aren't here to tell you that this is the answer. We don't know. And perhaps we can't know, because if the theories we're about to explore are even remotely possible, then there is another question we have to consider. What if the timeline we remember isn't the original timeline? What if history can diverge? What if reality can branch? And what if the people living inside that new timeline would never know that anything had changed? Tonight, we're not asking you to believe. We're asking you to imagine. So sit back, open your mind, and come with us on a journey into the unknown. A journey where the past may not be as fixed as we think. The future may not be as distant as it seems. And the reality we know may not be the only reality there has ever been. Because sometimes the most fascinating questions aren't about what we know. They're about what we think we know. And tonight, we begin with a message from the past. Part 1. A Fax from the Past. First fax, July 29th, 1998.
Dear Art, I had to fax when I heard other time travelers calling in from any time past the year 2500 AD. Please let me explain. Time travel was invented in 2034. Offshoots of certain successful fusion reactor research allowed. Scientists at CERN produced the world's first contained singularity engine. The basic design involves rotating singularities inside a magnetic field. By altering the speed and direction of rotation, you can travel both forward and backward in time. Time itself can be understood in terms of connected lines. When you go back in time, you travel on your original timeline. When you turn your singularity engine off, a new timeline is created, due to the fact that you and your time machine are now there. In other words, a new universe is created. To get back to your original line, you must travel a split second farther back and immediately throw the engine into forward without turning it off. Some interesting outcomes of this are: 1. You meet yourself. I have done it often, even taken a younger version of myself along for a few rides before returning myself to the new timeline and going back to mine. 2. You can alter history in the new universe that you have just created. Most of the time, the changes are subtle. Sometimes I'll notice car models that don't exist, or books that come out late. The oldest one was a skyscraper that wasn't built near a favorite store of mine in New York. Interestingly, when you travel in time, you must compensate for the orbit of the Earth. Since the time machine doesn't move, you have to adjust the engines, so you remain on the planet when you turn it off. Unfortunately, it was also discovered that anyone going forward in time, from my 2036, hit a brick wall in the year 2564. Everyone who has ever been there has reported that nothing exists. When the machine is turned off, you find yourself surrounded by blackness and silence. Now, most time travelers are trying to find out where the line went bad by going into the past, creating a new universe, and proceeding forward to see if the same thing results in 2564. It appears the line went bad around the year 2000. I'm here now, in this time, to test a few theories of mine before going forward. Now, for the future you might want to know about. 1. Y2K is a disaster. Many people die on the highways when they freeze to death trying to get to warmer weather. 2. The government tries to keep power by instituting martial law, but all of it collapses when their efforts to bring the power back up fail. 3. A power facility in Denver is able to restart itself, but is mobbed by hundreds of thousands of people and destroyed. This convinces most that maybe we shouldn't bring the old system back up. 4. A few years later, a communal government system is developed after the Constitution takes a few twists. China retakes Taiwan, Israel wins the largest battle for their life, and Russia is covered in nuclear snow from their collapsed reactors. Art, the reason I'm here now is because I believe a nuclear weapon set off by Iraq in the Middle East war with Israel might have something to do with the damaged timeline. I will test that theory and get back to you. Please pray that we discover the reason why there is no apparent future after 2564.
Second fax, 1998.
Dear Mr. Bell, I am glad you're back. I faxed this information to you the day before you left the air. I wanted to make sure it wasn't lost in the shuffle, so I am sending a gift. If you've already seen this, please accept my apologies. If you choose to make this public, please do not publish the fax number. I had to fax when I heard the other time traveler calling in from the recent time past in the year 2500 AD. Let me explain, Mr. Bell. I sent a fax with this opening on July 29, 1998. As I said, I am a time traveler. I have been on this world line since April of this year, and I plan to leave soon. Typically, time travelers do not purposely affect the world lines they visit. However, this mission is unusually long, and I've grown attached to some of the people I have met here. Anyway, for my own reasons, I have decided to help this world line by sharing information about the future with a few people in the hope that it will help their future. I am contacting you for the same reason. Unfortunately, there is no historical reference to your program in my world line. I believe you can change your future by creating one now. Some of the information presented on your program may be invaluable to upline researchers. I suggest you isolate the programs that concentrate on military technology and new physics theories. Transcribe these programs and put them someplace safe away. I recommend someplace in the Midwest. I also urge you to reconsider your paranoia to the Russians. They are not preparing for war with the average US citizen. They are preparing for war with the US government. They will eventually save this country and the lives of millions of Americans. I realize my claims are a bit difficult to accept, so I will send the following once I know you have received this fax. A few pages from the operations manual of my time machine, and a few colored photographs of my vehicle. If you wish to contact me, I will be happy to share with you the nature of time, the physics of time travel, and some of the events of your future. Please send a return package to
Part 2. Out of the Mouth of Babes, Max Laughlin, 2016 to 2017.
When you start thinking about an infinite number of parallel universes, you have to consider that every possible version of reality could exist somewhere. There could be another universe almost identical to ours, with only very small differences between them. And if there are an infinite number of these universes, then there are an infinite number of possibilities. My theory is that CERN may have done something that changed our reality. When the Large Hadron Collider was being used to collide particles at extremely high energies, they were attempting to recreate conditions similar to those that existed at the beginning of the universe. But what if something happened that we didn't understand? What if the experiment didn't simply produce the particle they were looking for? What if it changed the relationship between our universe and the other universes that exist alongside it? I believe that CERN may have destroyed the universe we originally occupied, or more accurately, caused us to move out of it. Instead of everything simply ending, we could have been shifted into the closest parallel universe. And if that universe was almost exactly the same as ours, we wouldn't necessarily know that anything had happened. We would wake up the next morning and everything would appear normal. Our houses would still be there. Our families would still be there. We would still have the same memories. We would still go to work and continue living our lives. But there could be differences, small differences, things that we remember one way, while the reality around us tells us something different. That's where the Mandela effect becomes interesting. People remember certain events, names, logos, movies, books, or other details differently from what the accepted records say. Normally, we would simply say that people have false memories. But what if some of those memories aren't false? What if they're memories from another universe? Imagine two universes that are almost identical. Everything is the same, except for a few small details. If something happened that moved us from one universe into the other, we wouldn't suddenly become aware that we had changed universes. We would simply continue living. The people around us would remember the history of the new universe. But some of us might remember things differently. That could explain why people have such strong memories of things that supposedly never happened. I'm not saying that every strange memory is proof of a parallel universe. I'm saying that if an infinite number of universes exist, then there are an infinite number of possible realities. And if CERN somehow caused a transition between those realities, then the differences between them might be exactly what we're seeing. The important question isn't necessarily whether we can see another universe. The question is whether we could have moved into one without realizing it. And if that happened, the only evidence we might have would be the things that don't quite match our memories. That's what makes the Mandela effect so interesting. Maybe we're not remembering incorrectly. Maybe we're remembering another reality.
Part 3. Comparison. These statements appear to come from two different timelines, yet they were made within a relatively short period of one another. So how could that be possible? To understand the possibility, we first have to consider the timeline described by John Titor. According to his account, the future is not necessarily a single fixed line of events. Instead, there are multiple world lines, and actions taken in the past can create a divergence that leads to another version of history. Now consider the chronology. One timeline supposedly originates in 2036, yet information from that future appears in communications dating back as far as 1998. If the claims are taken at face value, this creates an unusual situation. Information from a future timeline has entered the past and potentially influenced the sequence of events that followed. But what happens when a time traveler enters the past? According to Titor's own explanation, simply traveling into the past can result in a change to the world line. The traveler doesn't necessarily have to make some enormous alteration to history. Their presence alone introduces something that was not previously part of that timeline. Think about it this way. A time traveler arrives in 1998. From his perspective, he knows the history that led to 2036. But the moment he arrives, the circumstances are no longer identical to the history he remembers. He has introduced himself into a past where he was never supposed to exist. That creates the possibility of a divergence. And if that divergence occurs, the people living within the newly created timeline would have no reason to recognize that anything had changed. Their memories would tell them that their version of history was always the correct one. The traveler, however, could remember something different. He would remember the timeline he came from. This creates a fascinating problem when we compare statements made by people who may, hypothetically, originate from different world lines. The first statement comes from the Titor material and originates from a person claiming to have knowledge of events leading up to 2036. The second statement comes years later, around 2016, from Laughlin, who presented his own theory about CERN, reality, and the possibility of a parallel universe. At first glance, these may appear to be two completely separate ideas, but look more closely at what they have in common. Both involve CERN. Both involve a fundamental change to reality. Both involve the possibility of another timeline or parallel reality. And both raise the possibility that the reality we experience may not necessarily be the only version of reality that exists. There is, however, an important difference. Titor describes the phenomenon from the perspective of someone claiming to have knowledge of multiple world lines and the ability to travel between them. His explanation is that changing the past does not necessarily erase the original reality. Instead, it can produce or place the traveler into another world line. Laughlin's theory approaches the idea from the opposite direction. Rather than describing a traveler moving between timelines, he proposes that something associated with CERN may have caused us to end up in another reality. One describes the traveler moving. The other describes the reality around us changing. And that raises an intriguing possibility. What if they are describing the same phenomenon from opposite sides of the timeline? Perhaps what Titor describes as a world line divergence is what someone living within another timeline might interpret as a change in reality itself. If a traveler moves from timeline A into timeline B, the people already living in timeline B would not necessarily experience that event as a timeline change. To them, timeline B would simply be reality. The traveler, however, would carry memories of timeline A. That means the two realities could contain people who sincerely remember different versions of the same history. Neither person would necessarily believe they were mistaken. Each would be remembering what they experienced. And this is where the idea becomes particularly difficult to test. If a timeline changes and our memories change along with it, we would have no way of knowing that anything had happened. But if the traveler retains memories from the previous timeline, then that person becomes an anomaly, a living record of a history that everyone else believes never existed. Now imagine applying that possibility to the statements we are comparing. Perhaps one statement reflects the history of one world line, while the later statement reflects the history of another. Perhaps the differences between them are not contradictions at all. Perhaps they are clues that the people making the statements are describing events as they appeared from their own position within the timeline. Of course, this remains a hypothesis. There is no established scientific evidence that a CERN experiment moved humanity into another timeline, nor is there established evidence that John Titor was actually a time traveler. But if we temporarily accept the premise of multiple world lines, another question emerges. Would someone living inside a changed timeline even know that it had changed? Maybe not. Maybe the only person who would notice would be someone who remembered what came before. And that brings us back to the two statements. One appears to come from a future looking backward. The other appears to come from a present looking around at a reality that may be different from the one remembered. Different people, different years, different explanations, but perhaps the same underlying idea. What if both statements are accurate within their own timelines? And if that were possible, perhaps the real mystery isn't determining which one is correct. Perhaps the mystery is determining whether they could both be correct, just not in the same reality. Part 3. Final thoughts. It is difficult to ignore the coincidence. Years before the events we are discussing, John Titor was talking about CERN, high-energy experiments, micro-singularities, and changes to the timeline. Years later, Laughlin proposed his own theory connecting CERN with a possible shift from one reality into another. Two very different people, two very different explanations. And yet both stories eventually lead us back to the same place: CERN. But perhaps the most intriguing part is that CERN's story is far from over. The Large Hadron Collider is already one of the most powerful scientific instruments ever built, and scientists are now looking beyond it. CERN is studying the possibility of a future circular collider, a proposed machine that would be approximately 91 kilometers in circumference, about 3 times the size of the existing LHC. CERN describes it as a next-generation collider designed to investigate questions that remain beyond the reach of today's machines, including the search for new particles, new forces, dark matter candidates, and other phenomena that could reveal physics beyond our current understanding. The important word is proposed. The machine has not yet been built, and CERN expects a decision on whether to proceed around 2028. If approved, construction would begin in the early 2030s, with the collider potentially beginning operation in the 2040s. So what will humanity discover when we eventually build a machine 3 times larger than the LHC? Perhaps we will simply learn more about the fundamental building blocks of nature. Perhaps we will discover particles or forces that completely change our understanding of the universe. Perhaps we will uncover something we never anticipated. And then there is the question raised by the stories of John Titor and Laughlin. What if reality itself is not as fixed as we assume? If Titor's claims are taken at face value, a change in the timeline would not necessarily announce itself. There would be no alarm, no flashing warning, no moment when everyone suddenly realizes that history has changed. The people living inside the new timeline would simply experience it as reality. They would remember it as though it had always been that way. And if only the traveler remembered the original timeline, how would the rest of us ever know that anything had changed? We wouldn't. At least, not necessarily. Perhaps there would only be subtle inconsistencies, memories that don't match, details that seem different, Events that someone remembers occurring one way while everyone else remembers them another. Or perhaps there would be nothing at all. Maybe the entire idea is simply an interesting thought experiment, a collision of science fiction, speculative physics, and our fascination with parallel universes. But there is one thing we do know. We haven't finished exploring the unknown. CERN itself says that the purpose of the proposed FCC is precisely to investigate questions that today's technology cannot answer. The next machine could reveal something completely unexpected. And that leaves us with one final question. If humanity eventually creates a machine capable of probing deeper into the fundamental structure of reality, how would we know if we had discovered something? Or if we had changed something? Perhaps we would know immediately. Perhaps scientists would see it in the data. Or perhaps, if the most extraordinary version of this hypothesis were somehow true, we would simply continue living our lives, never realizing that the timeline we remember was no longer the timeline we were living in. And if that were possible, there would be no way for us to ask the people from the original timeline what happened. Because according to the theory, we couldn't, because we wouldn't be the time travelers. We would be the people who stayed behind. Thank you for watching Space: The Final Frontier Above and Beyond. Be sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss the next time we jump into the beyond.